Great. All right, so let's get started. So good evening, everybody. Welcome. It's so great to have you join us for our presentation about subway reefs with marine biologist Bob Martore. I am Matt Molina. I'm the director and founder of NYC H2O. And for those of you who are new to H2O, we are a nonprofit organization that provides environmental education and stewardship programs all around New York City. I'm joined tonight by Bob Martore, who I will introduce in a moment. Lana Rinsler, who is our communications and operations director, and David Chichuka, who is our assistant director. So, so we got the full H2O team here. Well, not the full H2O team, but a full H2O team. This is the third time that we're presenting Bob Martore and Subway Reefs. Subway Reefs were one of the very first programs that we presented about when we first started H2O back in 2010. We also presented Bob again in 2014. And the reason that we continue to present about Subway Reefs is one, Bob is a fantastic presenter, and two, the reefs continue to evolve as ecosystems. So there's always something new to explore and to report on. Bob Martore is the principal investigator and chief scientist for the artificial reef research for the state of South Carolina's Department of Natural Resources. He is responsible for the establishment of research reefs and the nation's first ever marine protected area around artificial reefs. This is extremely important because they provide safe havens to allow fish populations to recover from commercial overfishing. Bob has been working as a marine biologist with the state of South Carolina's Department of Natural Resources for over 35 years, and he continues to work to expand the artificial reef program by adding more reefs and more special marine protected areas. And most importantly, Bob Martore is a mensch. And I say that because this is the third time we're presenting him, and it's always a pleasure to work with him. Okay, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Bob Martore. Bob, please.
Take it away. Thanks a lot. All right. Thanks for joining us here this evening, everybody. Hopefully you'll learn a little bit. Oops, what happened here? Don't know why we started at the end, but I will get us set up in just a minute. All right, here we go. All right, I'm going to talk to you this evening about artificial reefs in general. I'm going to concentrate on the subway car artificial reefs. They are New York City subway cars, so I know there's a lot of interest in that. I think most people have heard the term reef at some point in time. A lot of people have some mistaken ideas about it. Most people, when they hear the term reef, they think of tropical coral reefs. This is what you normally see on TV, the discovery shows and things like that. A lot of places around the world have reefs like this, but these are only found in tropical waters. Along the east coast of the United States, we're temperate waters, so our reefs are a little bit different than this. We don't generally call them reefs. In fact, we just call them either hard bottom or live bottom areas. And the reason is because they always start in hard substrate. Our reefs are made up of rocky ledges like this. Sometimes they're high relief, like you see right here. They can be 8, 10, 12 feet tall. Sometimes they're just little patches of low relief. But in every case, a reef always begins with hard substrate. What you see here, for example, this is all rock around here, and things like corals and sponges, they attach to that rock and begin growing, colonizing it. These sorts of organisms cannot establish themselves on sand. Sand is just too dynamic. It shifts with the currents and tides. When storms come through, sand blows around. So a reef cannot be established in the sand. It's always on some sort of hard substrate. Give you a little idea of what it looks like. This is a little patch of hard bottom area here off South Carolina. Now, this looks like the ocean bottom, but it's actually not. These are rocky ledges that stick up from the sand. And you can see as we swing around here, this is the actual ocean bottom down in this little valley right here. That's the sand. And with these rocky ledges, you get invertebrate growth. And the important thing is, this is where most fish in the ocean live. Fish don't generally just swim around the ocean like one big giant fish bowl. They're looking for habitat. And these reef areas, that's their primary habitat. So it's very important habitat because most fish are found on just a few areas. The problem that most states face is that most of our continental shelf off the East Coast looks like this. It's just miles and miles of flat, featureless sand. You may have heard it referred to as the desert in the ocean. If you stand on the beach, for example, and you see that sandy beach, imagine that extending out just for miles and miles. Our surveys indicate that about 80% of the continental shelf off the East Coast looks just like this. Flat sand, not a whole lot of life to it. So that's why every coastal state has an artificial reef program, because we can actually supplement this type of bottom. We can help create a reef community in areas like this that are actually pretty barren. Now, the only difference between this and a reef area is the hard substrate, the rocks that stick up from that sand. So all we do in a reef program is provide the rocks. We provide hard substrate, and we can do it in a lot of different ways. Concrete works really well because it's very similar to the natural limestone rock that's found offshore. So when we put these things in the water, they become colonized just like the natural rocky areas do. Invertebrates will attach to our structures and start growing. Fish come to live around them, and before too long, you have a nice reef community. Now, all the organisms that you see on these structures are perfectly natural. You know, we call them artificial reefs, but the reef itself is not really artificial. It's a very natural reef. It just establishes around a man-made structure. Now, these organisms that you see here, and there's a lot of different things probably that you've never heard of. Everybody's heard of corals and sponges, but there's a lot of different organisms, things like tunicates and gorgonians and bryozoans. And all of these organisms, they're all animals, they're what are called broadcast spawners. That means when they reproduce, they just shoot their gametes up into the water column, and they drift along until they find an appropriate substrate where they can attach. And they'll attach to our structures just like they do to the natural rock that's out there. So when we put these structures there, nature takes over and creates the reef community. And that's really important because over time, it doesn't even look like a man-made structure anymore. And the fish that come live there, they don't know what it is or who made it or who put it there. So when you have larval and juvenile fish come and establish themselves around these areas, you're giving them habitat and refuge so that they can create a whole ecosystem. And what you're seeing right here is just a close-up of an artificial reef structure. You've got polyps of the invertebrates, juvenile fish that come live there. So we can create very natural and thriving reef communities in areas where previously there was nothing at all, simply by providing some hard substrate. Now, what we provide doesn't always have to look nice, like these structures that we build. We can use a lot of different things. Well, here, let me show you this first. That clip I showed earlier of that sandy bottom, that was an actual site survey. We were looking for a place to build an artificial reef. And this is what it looks like now, several years later. Just by putting these structures out there, they become colonized. You can see some nice corals down there. A lot of diversity in fish species live there. So we get a nice community around an area where previously there was nothing there at all. Now, as I mentioned, you don't have to use nice looking structures like that. You can use a lot of different things like rubble. This, for example, right here is the remains of a bridge here down in Charleston, South Carolina, where I am. There was a big bridge, spanned the harbor. When it was demolished, it was put underwater on several reef sites. There's a lot of material. And after a while, it actually looks very natural. These look like just regular boulders out there. They're in fact concrete from the concrete roadway. So again, you create a very natural community using these structures. And it's not just the concrete. We can use a lot of different things, like the steel trusses from those bridges. And this is what happened with the Tappan Zee Bridge. Both the steel and the concrete was placed off of Long Island. So you've got reef communities now that will look similar to this once they become colonized. Now, it might take a year or so for that to develop, but after time, this becomes a community just like any other natural area. Some of the other structures that we use, most programs use vessels of some sort in their programs, and a lot of programs are known for this. A lot of times when people think of artificial reefs, they think of sinking boats. And actually the whole idea of artificial reefs came because fishermen discovered that when they found a shipwreck, there were usually a lot of fish on it. So they came up with the idea of why don't we just do that on purpose and create something where we know fish will come and live. So we use down here vessels of all sizes. This is about a 100-foot long tugboat. We have larger vessels like this freighter right here, and even some really big ships. A lot of states have used old military vessels. Like this is a Liberty ship. A lot of folks have Liberty ships and Victory ships. Florida even has an aircraft carrier. So old naval vessels, they require a lot of cleanup, a lot of work to get them fit. But once they develop, they work out really well. Now a ship, because it's a very complex structure, it attracts a wide diversity of fish. You've got a lot of surface area that can be colonized by invertebrates, but you also have a lot of interior space where those juvenile fish are going to hide away. You know, they're looking for refuge from their predators. Show you a little clip right here. You can see as we swim up on the boat, all these fish that are gathered above the deck. They don't extend out too far, they're hiding there. Small fish, juvenile fish, they're looking for protection. They're looking for a physical presence in the water that they can associate with, where they can huddle around. It gives them a sense of protection, basically hiding from predators like this. You see these amberjacks swimming by, they're there to feed on these fish. Now what you don't see, you can see like a hole in the deck here, and the windows in the pilot house are missing. Inside this vessel, there's juvenile fish in the whole thing, and they're looking for protection. They're looking for refuge to hide from those predators. Now, the idea of using the subway cars for artificial reefs actually came from a program we did with the military, the Department of Defense. They provided military vehicles, armored vehicles like these personnel carriers that you see right here. They provided the vehicles, they did all the cleanup, and that was sort of the template for the subway car program, the cleaning protocols, removing the engines like you see here, the transmissions are taken out. The whole thing is steam cleaned to make it clean enough to put in the ocean without causing problems. And once it's there, it's basically a big steel box. So you have water flowing through it, which means it's colonized on the inside and on the outside. Anytime you put down a hard, durable structure like this, it's going to become colonized by both invertebrates. That's the basis of the reef community. And then the fish are going to come and live around that as well. Got a couple of clips here to show you of these structures. Now, the nice thing about something like this is, if you remember that earlier video with the live bottom area, with the rocky ledges, you get sort of a little valley, a canyon in between the outcroppings. And we can simulate that, something similar like you see right here. So even though these vehicles haven't been in the water for a long time, they still have a lot of life around them. You can see all these little things right here. These are larval fish, and they're looking for protection from guys like this. So we can help provide that, which again increases fish populations because we're providing refuge for these small fish. Now again, like I said, these haven't been in the water very long, not a lot of growth yet. Over time, they're going to look like this. You can see they get a lot of 3D growth. And when you have structures that look like this is when you really get a complete ecosystem. You can't really see in amongst all this growth, but there are larval and juvenile fish hiding among there. There are crustaceans like small shrimp and crabs that live in there, polychaetes, marine worms, things like that. Everything that you'd find naturally in the ocean is going to be living in this material right here. So in an area that was previously just flat sand with very little life, we now have a thriving ecosystem and a complete food web. Everything that you'd see in a natural live bottom area is now on our artificial structure. So as I said, this was sort of the inspiration to use subway cars as artificial reefs. And the cars that were used they're called Redbirds. I'm sure many of you have ridden on these things many, many times. Now in the past, when these cars went out of service, they generally were just a few at a time, and the transit authority would just scrap them or somehow get rid of them like that. It wasn't really a big deal. But back around the year 2000, They were going to retire over 1,200 of these cars all at once. That was a major undertaking. They didn't really know what to do with them all. It was going to cost them a lot of money. When you scrap something, you have to cut it up into pieces. And with that many vehicles, it was going to cost them more to scrap than it would for them, that they'd make in the metal, from that scrapping process. So they started looking for some way that they could get rid of these. For them, it was economic incentive. How could they get rid of these vehicles more economically feasible to save a little money? And that's when they heard about the Reefs program with the military using those armored vehicles. So they thought, why don't we try that? They approached all the different states to see what would need to be done. They approached EPA and said, how can we do this environmentally sound? And we came up with a list of protocols for how to clean them, how to get them ready to use. And most states along the East Coast accepted these in some form or another. Now, this is what the inside of a subway car looks like when it's in use. I'm sure, as I said, many of you probably recognize that. But before we could take them, anything plastic, anything floatable, all of that was removed. This one still has the windows here, but actually windows and doors were all removed as well. So these became basically just big open boxes. Here you can see all the windows and doors. And that makes perfect habitat out in the ocean. Fish like that cave-like appearance. They normally would live under overhangs in little caves, things like that. So this made really effective habitat. You can see here, these cars were actually in use the very week before they were in the water. It didn't take long at all. They were in use one day, off the tracks the next, cleaned up in a day or two, and on a barge ready to go. They'd load 50 of these vehicles on a barge at one time and make trips up and down the East Coast. They went down as far as Georgia, received some of these. So they were very generous in their distribution. They went a lot of different places. Again, with the close-up, you can see with those windows and doors removed. And it's just a simple process of, you see the big crane on board, push them over, and that's all there was to it. Now, what I'm going to show you next is a series of video clips, basically a timeline from when we first put these in the water up until the present day. Give you an idea of how they develop over time. So this first clip was the very day that we put them in the water. We pushed them all overboard, then we went overboard as well, went and took a look at them. You can see there's no growth on any of the structure yet. There's no fish yet, nothing's found it. It's just bare metal with water flowing through it. Really not much to see. And that's pretty typical when something first goes in, just like you'd imagine it looked like, just like it did when it was on the land. Doesn't take long though before fish find it and things start happening. Gonna jump ahead here. Only 3 months later, that's when this is. And this is pretty typical of what we find with a lot of reef material. What you're seeing here are small bait fish that will school all around the vehicle. A structure like this is basically a big wall that we put underwater. So currents will come by and hit that, and you've probably heard the term upwelling. Well, this causes upwelling. The currents hit that and go up, and so nutrients, detritus, things like that, that usually filter down through the water column, they're resuspended, pushed back up into the water column. So all these little fish, these are planktivores, they feed on those little particles like that. So they will swarm all around it, feeding on those particles. So as I said, for a structure like this, generally the first things that you see are those small fish that are there to feed. They're not really there to live full time, but they're there to feed on the resuspended organic particles. Inside the structure, you also get fish, but a different type. These fish are generally juvenile fish, whereas those other bait fish are there to feed on the suspended particles. Well, we picked up a passenger here along the way. But these smaller fish, they're there looking for refuge. They're looking for a house to live in, basically. So that's why you see different species inside from what you see outside. And again, every part of the vehicle serves a purpose. Here you see, for example, these are called Atlantic spade fish, sort of big-bodied fish, and they're there looking for some way to save energy. When you have a lot of current coming by, they want to get out of that current so they don't have to use energy to stay where they want to be. So they're hiding away under there basically until the tides change, until they can come out and swim around and feed. So again, this is a 3-month period where you start seeing a little bit of growth and the fish start showing up, some that will stay there, some that are just there temporarily, but you also get occasional visitors. You've heard the title of the talk was Sea Turtles on the Seven, and sea turtles are actually a very common visitor to these reefs. Turtles like this, they're air breathers. They have to come up and take a breath, but they can stay underwater for several hours at a time. And we see them very frequently, basically taking naps on our subway car. They'll find a place to wedge themselves in, so again, so they don't have to expend energy. They'll crawl up under there and just take a nap, and they'll sleep there for 2 hours at a time. So turns out subway cars are basically napping areas for sea turtles. Very common that we see that. All right, now I'm going to jump ahead to 1 year now these cars have been in the water. You can see the growth on the vehicle is considerable. Almost all the surface area is now covered. But the really important thing, the thing that tells us this is working out well, are the types of fish that we start to see now. For example, these fish that you see over here, these are sea bass, black sea bass. And what we found is that once a sea bass takes up residence in an area, it generally stays there. They'll seek out a certain area and defend it. It'll become their home. This fish here, this is a triggerfish, very similar. Now, triggerfish, they'll actually feed off the material itself. They pick at those little polyps and things like that. But the triggerfish, they'll go out in the sand in between subway cars and dig out a little nest. They actually nest in the sand in a protected area. We found both of these species will spawn on these subway cars. Once they become established there, it's their new home now. They live there full time, and they're now breeding here. This is where we see the increased production of an area like an artificial reef like this. We've established permanent species now that are using this as permanent habitat, just like those natural reef areas. So we know at this point, we're going to see increased production on this reef site. Now, just like you saw those sea turtles visiting subway cars, we get other things as well. Anytime you have a lot of life on a structure, you're going to get the predators that are there to feed off some of those fish. And again, very common, we'll see these, like the dolphin here, diving down, take a few fish, swim back up. So again, it's just a testament to the numbers of fish that we see on structures like this. All right, I'm going to jump ahead again, and now we're looking at 5 years that these structures have been underwater. And now at this point, we really see increased diversity. We have a lot of growth on the structure itself. We've had a lot of seasonal changes. We're getting some, you start seeing the big 3-dimensional fluffy sort of growth, but now we're seeing a lot of different species. Like here, you see this is a grouper over here. We have a couple of red snapper coming by. So we really start seeing a wide variety of fish. After 5 years, now this is permanent habitat. And anything that's out there in the ocean looking for some place to live, some place to feed. And again, different fish utilize structures like this for different things. Some fish will live inside here and swim out into the sand to feed, come back again. Some fish will stay during the day, go out at night, come back again. Some fish will stay here all the time, feeding on the structure itself. As I said, spawning, digging their nests, things like that. But this is now a fully functional ecosystem. Everything that we see on natural live bottom areas is here on these structures as well. Also, here we go. Those seats that you were sitting on before, you really don't want to be sitting on those areas anymore, because these are, with the plastic removed, those are just basically big holes now. So anything that lives in a cave out in the ocean is going to take up residence on these things as well. And you'll see as I swim in close here, got a little moray eel. He's now established a home inside the seat of the subway car. So again, just to reemphasize, everything that you see offshore in the ocean is going to live on these artificial structures, just like they do on the natural structures. So that's inside the car. We've also got outside. because of all the upwelling that it causes, all the surface area that's got all the growth on it, we start seeing things like migratory pelagic species, things like these amberjack that you see right here. They're more migratory. They roam around. They don't generally stay in one spot. But when you've got, you can sort of see in the background all those bait fish up there. That's what brings in fish like this. And I've been in schools of amberjack that are so thick you can't even see around you. You couldn't see the subway cars. That's how thick they come in when you've got big schools of bait like this that they can feed on. And again, outside here, you see all the growth. You've got sponges. The yellow that you see is actually an encrusting sponge. This, I get a lot of questions about this white growth. It looks like coral. This is actually a crystalline algae. It's an algae that has a carbonate exoskeleton. So we see, again, everything that's offshore, from corals and sponges to algae and tunicates and everything else, and everything that lives within that. Again, you don't see everything up close, all the things living among that, but it's all there. Everything that's offshore naturally is here. So we have a very thriving ecosystem and a very complete food web. And we know we've documented spawning on these sites so that we know we're increasing fisheries resources on these areas. One other thing that I wanted to show in this same 5-year time period, hard corals, they take a long time to become established and they're very slow growing. So when we see them on a structure, like you see up here, these are 2 different species of coral that have taken hold and they're actually thriving now. So this really tells us that we have a good, stable ecosystem. The material is not moving, it's not eroding, it's given these things time to grab hold and start growing. So that really tells us that this is a very successful reef. This is the point where we said the subway cars are really working and working well. All right, now we're going to jump ahead 12 years. These structures have been in the water now at this point. Now, after 5 years, we have that complete ecosystem. Now we're seeing yearly variability and seasonal variability. You've got succession on the car itself. You might get some corals, and then you might get something that's overgrown. Hydroids will grow over it. It's going to change season to season. That's very typical. Depending on if you have a warm year, a colder year, that's going to determine what's going to stay there, what's going to grow there. And same thing with the fish life as well. You're going to see seasonal variability. And again, year to year, the same fish are not there all the time. They grow, they spawn. Those smaller fish will often move on to colonize other places. But again, this is a nice ecosystem. Now, at this point, what we're looking at, we know we've got a lot of fish life. We know we have good diversity. So what we want to look at now is the stability of the structures themselves. Are these cars going to stay upright and whole? Now, with concrete, we know when we put that out, it's going to be there for 100 years, no problem. Something like an armored military vehicle, because of the thickness of that metal, that's going to be there for decades as well. The subway cars, that was questionable. We didn't really know how long they would last. We hoped that they would last about 20 years. The important thing with reef material is you want it to last long enough for several generations of fish. Once you have a fish that lives there and spawns there, you know that you're creating fish. A structure, and back in the early days of reef building, people didn't know what would work and what wouldn't. They'd put out a car body that would rust in 6-month time and be gone. So initially, while something's there, it might attract fish, but unless that structure stays there for several generations of fish, it's not actually producing fish. It's just attracting them from other areas. So that's why the material that we use, we want to know that it's going to last for many, many years. So again, at this point, 12 years in, we're looking at how stable are these structures, how are they lasting? And I will tell you that at this point, we still had about 80% of the vehicles just like this, upright, whole, very complete. So that was a good sign. 12 years, we thought if we get a few more years out of that, that'd be great. As it turns out, we did a little better than that. I'm going to jump ahead again now to 20 years these have been in the water. I shot this video Just at the end of last year. So this is only a couple months old. And as I said, we're 20 years now that these vehicles have been in the water. And you can see all the life that they're still holding. We still have a lot of upright structure. So we still get that upwelling. We get the bait fish. We get the schooling fish. Here's another. And again, one of the things we're looking at is how are they holding up? And now at this 20-point period, or 20-year period, you can see some deterioration, but we still had roughly 60% of the vehicles whole and upright. So we were really pleased about that. Having that many cars still functioning well, we thought that was really great. Here's one more video of that 20-year time period. We'll see a little school of snapper over here. But again, this gives you a good idea of how these vehicles are starting to deteriorate now. Some of the side panels are falling in, and you'll see in another shot, some of the roof panels are falling in. So now at this point, we know we're providing a lot of habitat for a lot of species. And we don't want to lose all these when these cars do eventually collapse. So this is where reef management comes in. What can we do now to keep these species in this area? So it's at this point that we'll start bringing in other material. For example, last year we sank a steel-hulled shrimp trawler very close to this. A few months before that, a tugboat. Now, a lot of folks want to know what happens when these actually do collapse. Will they still function? And the answer to that is yes, but they hold different types of fish. Now, you see up here on the roof, with all this growth, and you see all those, well, you did see those larval fish, the juvenile fish living in there. Even when these collapse and they're just low relief piles of rubble, they still provide habitat to those small juvenile fish. So you won't see the upwelling effect. You won't see those, the bait fish and the predators, but it will still be refuge for juvenile fish. But in order to have juvenile fish, you have to have spawning populations. So that's why we want to supplement this area now with other structures that will continue to hold those adult fish. So again, there is a little bit of management that comes into it. It's not just throw something in the ocean and see what happens. Just a couple more pictures to show you here, the school of snapper down there. And inside the vehicle, we have a nice school of spade fish there, a couple of other grunts and things. So these are still providing good habitat to a lot of different species. And again, I said after 20 years, we feel like these have been a successful program. We're happy with it. So even if they don't last too much longer, we think the overall success was certainly worth it. It's done a good job of holding things. Now, down here in South Carolina, we have reef sites all across our state. We have nearshore reefs, offshore reefs, a lot of different depths and things like that. The subway cars we put on our deepest reef sites, these yellow stars here. And the reason for that was to try and make them last as long as they possibly could. You're going to have currents that come by. We have hurricanes down here, so you get storm events and things like that. So we know there's going to be pressure on those cars. So the deeper you can put them, the less wave energy they're going to feel. It just helps them last a little bit longer. So as I said, there is a little bit of management that comes into this. And that's important for us to create habitat, because down here, especially, water tourism, marine tourism is a big deal. A lot of people use these sites. Give you an idea of how much habitat was created by those subway cars. Some of the different things that and when we talk about habitat, we measure it in cubic feet, because obviously these structures have length, they have width, they also have height. So we measure these in cubic feet. When we put out, for example, a barge load of these concrete units, we generally put 100 of these on a barge, and that creates about 12,500 cubic feet of habitat. Now, a barge load of armored personnel carriers, generally there's 20 of these on a barge. That'll create about 35,000 cubic feet of habitat. A tugboat like this one, this is a 100-foot boat, it's much taller than those other structures. So we get about 63,000 cubic feet. Move up to one of the larger ships. This is a 175-foot coastal freighter. We've created over 130,000 cubic feet of habitat. Now those subway cars, 50 subway cars on a barge at one time, each of them 50 feet long, roughly 10 feet tall, creates over 200,000 cubic feet of habitat. So getting these structures meant a lot to any reef program that got them. It creates a lot of habitat, a lot of area that fish can use. And that's important because it also creates a lot of fishing success, a lot of marine tourism. Now, fishing down here, recreational fishing in particular, is very popular, very big. Our commercial fishery is not as big as you have up there in the Northeast, but recreational fishing is very important for a lot of different types of species. And when you have a lot of fishing like that, that leads to economic impact. So we periodically measure how much these reefs are bringing in by fishermen, by divers. Are they coming to just fish on the reefs? And again, what you're seeing here is 1 year sales generated strictly by artificial reef users. Now you see back here in the 90s, we did a couple of economic impact surveys and measured $17 and $22 million of impact to local communities. And we thought that was pretty impressive. Now, in between here, this is where the subway car project came in. We put cars out in 2001 and 2002. And you can see with our next survey, the tremendous jump in economic value. People were coming to town specifically to fish or dive on these subway cars. I'll tell you, we actually got interest from not only all over the country, but all over the world. We had television stations from Switzerland, Germany, Japan. Everybody wanted to know about subway cars as artificial reefs. So it generated a lot of interest, and that in turn generated a lot of value for local communities. I can tell you, it's pretty interesting to see yourself speaking Japanese in an interview. So we know that our reefs are producing fish. We know that they're producing money, but we want to know, how can we best use artificial reefs in fisheries management? We are, after all, a natural resource agency. It's our job to manage the use of these fish. We want to make them last for future generations. We are a conservation agency. So we don't just want to put these reefs out there, let everybody come and fish them, and that's the end of it. So that's when we started our research reefs to see really how much fish do they produce, and can we use reefs in different ways that have not been used before. One of the things that we did was look at using artificial reefs strictly as fisheries enhancement devices, building something that people would not fish on and just see how much fish will that produce. And that led to our first research reefs. If you look at a typical reef site and let people fish on it, you'll still get some fish, but it does tend to get overfished fairly easily. But if you build the same exact thing in a similar area, same depth, not too far away, but protect it, don't let people fish on it, the difference is noticeable. Now, obviously, we do scientific studies, we have data, numbers, statistics, the whole thing. But people look at it, and just the noticeable difference is what strikes most people. They don't really care about the numbers. They just look at it and say, wow, what a difference. So we knew that creating a protected reef would create a lot of fish. Can we target those? Can we put them in different areas where we know certain types of fish will inhabit to create populations of different things? So our next site, we went a little bit deeper, a different area, and we were able to produce red snapper. These are all red snapper that you see right here. And this is a very heavily overfished species, so much so that on the Atlantic and Gulf states, there was a moratorium on these fish for many years. People could not fish for them at all. But by creating a protected habitat like this, we're actually increasing populations. A lot of folks wonder about, well, they don't really look like red snapper, but underwater, they look silver. You need direct sunlight really to see. They don't really look red until you get them out of the water. But trust me, these are red snapper. There's a lot of red snapper. And again, we document that they will spawn on our reef sites, which is what we need in order to repopulate these overfished species. So we know it works in relatively shallow water depths and medium shelf depths, how about deep water things? Some of the most heavily fished commercially species are deep water groupers. So can we create something, a spawning area for deep water groupers that are overfished? So we went out, and I'll just tell you, you see this depth right here, it says 96. This is meters, not feet. So this is over 300 feet deep. This video is actually shot by an ROV, a remotely operated vehicle. And 2 years after putting out these structures, we've got it colonized by snowy grouper, misty grouper, Warsaw grouper, all these species that are overfished commercially, that regional fishery councils were most interested in protecting. So with data like this, we were able to go to our Fishery Management Council. And again, the nation is broken up into regional fishery management councils. These are the groups that create fishery regulations. When you go and fish for certain species and you read the rules that say you can only catch 2 of these or 3 of these, they have to be 15 inches long or whatever. These are the councils that make those regulations. So we went to our council, the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council, showed them our information that we had, showed them the videos like that, and said, we want to protect these areas so that people can't fish there. So they're just used for fisheries enhancement. So through their regulatory process, and I will tell you, it's a lengthy and prolonged process, public meetings, public comment, things like that. But over time, we were able to get some of our reef sites classified in a couple of different ways. See here, deep water marine protected areas. These were the first fully protected areas on the East Coast, MPAs they're called, marine protected areas. And one of which is our deep water artificial reef protected area. As Matt mentioned at the beginning, the first artificial reef marine protected area in the country. We started it, created it, and it's been highly successful. Some of our other sites are called spawning SMZs, special management zones. This is another classification, but it has the same protections. You can't go in there and fish for those species. So things like the black sea bass and the triggerfish and the red snapper, those will spawn in shallower water than those groupers, but now they have protected areas as well. So again, as I said, we go out and we study these areas. We know that they're utilizing them. We know that they're spawning on them. So we know that we are in fact enhancing fishery production by creating artificial reefs that are protected areas. Even though they're relatively small areas, compared to, for example, a live bottom ledge might extend for several miles. These areas are 1.5 miles square, relatively small. But by protecting them, the numbers of fish that they produce is greater than you would find in a 20-mile long natural ledge. It's remarkable how quickly they colonize, become acclimated to the area, and start reproducing and adding fish. So we've had great success creating these areas. We've been able to protect these areas going through our federal regulatory process. And now we have protected areas that we know are adding to fishery resources offshore. So just to sum everything up for you, when you create an artificial reef, you create enhanced recreational opportunities for both anglers and divers. These are generally easily accessible areas, so fishermen know where they are, how to get to them. They know they don't have to go miles and miles offshore searching for a good habitat. Divers know that they will find something interesting to dive on, whether it's a subway car, which incidentally is really caused a lot of interest in recreational diving because people get a thrill just swimming through a car. So that's something you don't normally get to see. So it's increased recreational angling and diving here off of our coast. And that in turn creates economic benefit for local communities. The tremendous influx of people fishing and diving has put millions of dollars back in local communities. And I will also add, there is another economic benefit to creating an artificial reef, and that is what these organizations save by putting structure out there instead of having to find some way to dispose of it. As I mentioned, the New York City Transit Authority they gave us subway cars primarily for their economic benefit. They told us that by giving away these cars, even though they paid for barging these vehicles up and down the coast, their overall cost savings in disposing of 1,200 cars, it saved them $22 million by giving these cars away rather than having to dismantle them, scrap them, clean them. You have to clean them differently before you can scrap them as well. So it saved them money and it created money for us. And finally, overall, it increases fishery production for many, many species. We've documented spawning of so many, and not just species, but species of particular interest, species that these management councils are most interested in protecting. Things like the red snapper and the grouper, things that fishermen are really heavily overfishing. By giving them protected areas where we know they're going to spawn, we're increasing those numbers for years and years to come. So that is all that I have to say. And I think at this point, Matt is going to take some questions, and I'll be happy to answer whatever I can.
That's terrific. Thank you, Bob. Wow, I learned so much. What an interesting and inspiring talk. So we have some great questions from the audience, and we're going to start to go through them. And feel free, everybody, to keep your questions coming in. We have some really great questions. Zach Youngerman asks, is there any variation or issues with different types of materials, steel versus concrete, texture, reactivity, etc.?
There is, and then again, that's one of the aspects of managing a reef program. Obviously, concrete is a very, well, it's a little more complex than you might think. It functions very well. It colonizes quickly. As I mentioned, it's very similar to limestone rock, but you do have to be careful about additives that are in some concrete. So you do have to be careful about what types of concrete you use. That obviously still works better than steel. The steel you have to be careful of. How thick is it? How heavy is it? It's just a matter of what the material is. For example, those bridges, big thick steel I-beams, that's going to last a long time. It's not going to erode. Over the years, we've learned not to use some things. As I said, a lot of reef programs in the early days would put automobile bodies out in the ocean. Those were more trouble than they were worth. They didn't last, eroded away very quickly. So there is a difference in materials. Most reef programs now will only use concrete and steel, and the steel, people are very picky about what types of steel that we'll use. Thank you.
And as a follow-up to that, are there certain materials that cannot be used that might be polluting? For example, material from roadbeds. And this is a question from Jean Gazis.
Right. Yes, absolutely. We can't use, for example, asphalt. A lot of roadways, even some of the bridges, they'll have asphalt covering the concrete, which has to be stripped off before you can use it. Something like that, it has hydrocarbons in it, which will leach into the water, which obviously is not healthy for anybody, the fish or the people that eat the fish. So yes, it has to be clean material, something that we know will not leach into the water over time.
Great, thank you. Zach Youngerman asks, what sort of research and modeling is required to make sure that the site makes sense and the materials don't get carried away or wash up on shore?
Right. That's actually something that some states have had some problems with that. We've learned through basically trial and error what types of things we can use and where we can put it. Just for example, what I said about the subway cars, going in deeper water so that we could help them last a little bit longer, have a little bit less wave energy. You have to evaluate each structure that you're going to use and determine where it's most appropriate. Obviously, we can't use lightweight materials. Those will move very easily. Something even like a small ship, if we have a hurricane come by, for example, will it move outside a permitted area? We don't want those close to shore. Florida and North Carolina, and again, in the early days of reef building, they put out thousands and thousands of tires, automobile and truck tires. And then about 2 decades later, they spent millions of dollars cleaning up all those tires that washed up on their beaches. So you do have to look at every single structure and basically determine what is a worst case scenario. What will this happen? What will happen to this through wave energy if you don't anchor it to the bottom? So you do have to very carefully evaluate everything that you use.
Great. Jordan Daly asks, are there fish colonized on the Titanic?
More than likely, yes. And now I haven't been down there personally, but generally anywhere you have structure like that, you're going to find some sort of life. Even down there, it's very cold water, but they found life basically anywhere. So it would not surprise me at all. And especially with so many years of nobody finding it, it was probably a very nice protected area. It probably contributed a lot to fishery resources.
Makes sense. Catherine Winkleman asks, when first putting the reef in the water in a barren area like the continental shelf off the East Coast, do you have to add gametes to get things going, or does nature just do the work for you?
Nature does everything. We don't have to add anything at all. We actually did experiment with transplanting some corals and some other organisms like that to see if it made a difference, and it really didn't. Nature takes over very quickly, and structures become colonized within a matter of months, so we really don't have to do anything at all.
Great. Catherine Fredman asks, when dumping the subway cars or personnel carriers into the water, how are they placed on the bottom? Are they placed in a particular formation?
They're not. Now, something like the subway cars, we can sort of get them in formation because they're lined up right next to each other on a barge. So as we just go down the line, pushing one after another off, they end up that way on the bottom. Something like the subway cars, somewhat similar, but there's a little bit different procedure. Generally speaking, we have a permitted area, which is a large area. Usually it's at least a half mile square. And we'll pick out a spot within that permitted area, place a marker buoy on it, and tell the barge, okay, basically slowly circle that buoy as you drop these overboard. So you're sort of placing them in a specific design, but if they end up just sort of scattered about, it really doesn't make a lot of difference. And again, we tried it both ways, and what's most cost effective? Is it worth the extra cost of trying to place things one at a time as opposed to just knocking them over? Does it really make a difference? Turns out it really does not.
Okay, thank you. Andrew Garn asks, do you keep data on how artificial reefs have increased fish and invertebrate populations? And it certainly sounds like you have, but maybe you want to add something.
We have a very extensive database, both numbers that we go down and do surveys and things like that. And we always shoot video when we go as well. So we've spent hours and hours back in the office going through these video clips, counting everything that's there. So yes, we have a very extensive database of how populations have varied over the years and where they've increased and where they haven't. And it just helps us know where to build and for what species we need to target.
Got it. Nancy Hughes and David Fitterman asked about what was the depth that subway cars were submerged. I think you talked about this, but it might be worth repeating. And then as a follow-up, Nancy asks, are artificial reefs effective at any depth? I know you talked about a range of depths, but maybe you can just add a few words about this.
Yeah, the 4 different reef sites that have subway cars range from 90 feet to 120 feet. Those are other than our deep water protected area, those are our deepest sites. As far as working in any depth, they do. They just attract different species in different water depths. Near shore reefs obviously attract fish that generally stay in shallow water. The one place where we found that artificial reefs are not very effective is actually inshore, in harbors and rivers and things like that. It's a very different type of ecosystem with different types of habitat. For example, down here, there's a lot of marsh habitat. There's a lot of even things like docks and piers and things like that. There's so much habitat inshore that adding structure on an artificial reef, we found that while it will work, it will attract some fish, it doesn't really compete well with so much other structure that's already there. So again, you have to look at everything as a cost-effective measure. Is it worth the money that we spend to build a reef inshore? Will that work well enough to justify what we paid to build that? And it turns out in bays and harbors and things like that, it does not. But as soon as you get offshore in the ocean, it works much better.
Great, makes sense. Melinda Alfano, who is an H2O board member, hi Melinda, asked a question that I'm really interested in. Can you share one of your most memorable dives or favorite fish sightings at one of these reefs?
Oh gosh, I've had so many interesting experiences. I will tell you, a lot of people always ask about sharks. Do you see a lot of sharks? We sometimes see sharks, and it's exciting. It's not like, well, one time I did get a little nervous. A lot of times we'll see sharks on, for example, tugboats and things like that, vessels like that. And usually you'll see a handful at a time, and it's really interesting. I have some really good pictures that I've shot, up close with sharks, things like that. I was on one dive where there were probably 10 or 12 sharks, big sharks, swimming all around, and they became curious and started approaching us. So we very quickly went back to our descent line and swam back up, and some of them followed us up. So that was a little nerve-wracking. But other than that, it's really exciting to see all the different things. I've seen, stingrays that are 6 feet in diameter. I played tug of war with an octopus one time. That was kind of fun. So there's a lot of things, a lot of interesting things to see out there. Absolutely.
Why were you playing tug of war with an octopus? How did you?
Well, I found on one of our artificial reefs, there was sort of a crevice among the material. And I noticed a pile of shells outside that. Now, octopus, they will take shells, clams, oysters, whatever, and they pry them open and they feed on those things. And so seeing all this pile of shells outside this hole, I figured there's probably an octopus in there. So I took one of those shells and I waved it around in front of the opening, and sure enough, tentacle reached out and grabbed hold. Played a little bit before, before I finally let go.
Okay, gotcha. The octopus won. But it was his home. I think you made the right choice. Okay. Karen wanted to just make a comment that Karen Lund, lives in New York City and remembers taking the Redbird subway cars, and just says how cool it is to think that a subway car that she used to ride is now part of an underwater reef. And I agree with that sentiment. Thank you, Karen. Lee Kish asks, how far from the shore are these distributed? I know you said the depths. Can you remind us how far out they are?
Well, the subway cars themselves range from about 12 miles to about 30 miles offshore. Our reef sites range right on the shore. We actually have some on fishing piers right at the shoreline. So overall, our artificial reefs range from right on the coast to 50 miles offshore.
Brooklyn Parrots asks, is there any danger of messing up an ecosystem by providing too much artificial habitat for creatures that live on these reefs? And then as a related question, Adam Abadi asks, when creating the subway reefs, how do they know that the reefs won't disrupt the ocean ecosystem in a harmful way? such as causing overpopulation of certain fish species?
Yeah, no, that's a legitimate question, but even when I show you these structures, and it looks like, there can be hundreds, even thousands of fish swimming around these. But if you were to, say, get in a drone and go way up high and look down, these are like pin drops compared to the ocean. Um, one reef site, for example, a typical reef site, as I said, half a mile square, and it may look like a lot of material in that reef site. But really, when you calculate the actual footprint of material compared to that reef site, most of our sites are about 2% covered. Some might get up to 5% covered, but that's it. So they're really very small areas compared to that whole vast ocean. So when you look at the entire continental shelf, 200 miles off the coast, these are tiny little footprints in that area. So we don't think it's a bad thing to help increase fish populations, particularly because so many of them are overfished.
Right, and it seems, from your video and what you were saying, that there's quite a diversity, and that those are native species.
Exactly. Everything that's on an artificial reef is a species that would be found naturally in that area anyway. They're not bringing in unusual things. It's just really giving these fish another area, another habitat that they can inhabit to help increase populations. So we don't see disruptions in natural life histories or anything like that at all.
Gotcha. Nancy Lambert asks, with the planning of wind farms offshore, might those also create artificial reef space?
Absolutely. That's one of the things that we've actually looked at that. We've talked with these wind farm companies and how they're going to be building them. Basically, the islands that form the base of a turbine functions exactly like an artificial reef. It'll work exactly the same way.
Interesting. So there's a double benefit. That's great.
Right.
Anthony Rose asks, the Trolleys was a site on the New Jersey coast, and the cars disintegrated, and unfortunately it became a pile of debris. How long do you anticipate the subway cars would last? And I think you had answered that. You had hoped that they would last 20 years, and many of them have. You said about 80% are still standing.
Right. Now, I will tell you that those subway cars in New Jersey that disintegrated, those are a different subway car. That project was done after this. Those were called Brightliners. They were stainless steel cars. It did not hold up well at all. They've had some problems. Some of the material has shredded and moved around a little bit. But as I said, it's a different project. We're certainly happy with what we got down here with these redbirds. I don't know the final outcome of those in New Jersey. I know that a lot of the material was just buried over. When it disintegrates and becomes so low profile that sand covers it as the currents come by, a lot of that material will be covered up. I did hear that in some instances, some commercial trawlers and things like that had actually scooped up a few pieces of metal. But generally speaking, when you've got something that's going to lay flat on the ocean bottom, it's going to get covered up by sand and bury before it moves very far.
Gotcha. So somebody asked how many subway cars are there. So I'll just answer that. There were 1,300 that were reefed all along the Atlantic coast. Bob, how many did you guys get?
We got 200.
Okay.
Most of them went to Delaware just because it was closer, saved the MTA some money to stay close. But they got almost 700. We got 200. I think Virginia got about 150. Georgia, the same thing. So.
Gotcha. Riyadh Etheridge asks, do you expect that you'll have more subway cars? And the answer is no. And the reason for that is the recycling techniques are such that now while 20 years ago it was not economically, it was economically beneficial to just to use these as artificial reefs. The the materials are such, and the recycling techniques are such that it's more cost beneficial to recycle the material. So, so there won't be any more reefing of retired subway cars. That's, and then as a follow-up question, buses will not be used. That, you know, that material is not substantial enough for these artificial reefs. Nancy asks, we noticed one diver with a zookeeper and a sling. Are these artificial reefs being populated with lionfish? Has that become an issue? A lionfish is an invasive species.
Exactly. Lionfish are an invasive species. They started down in the Caribbean and slowly started making their way up the East Coast. And we are now beginning to see quite a few lionfish on some of these. And yes, what you saw that was actually me with a zookeeper and a spear cleaning off lionfish, removing them from the reef site.
Wow, cool. That was very astute, Nancy. Thank you for asking that. Okay, moving along. Chuck Woody, Badwi. Oh wait, sorry. Okay, someone asks, I assume that the iron in the cars also assists in some chemical reaction that's good for carbon dioxide management and other processes for sea life compared to other materials. Do you have any comment about that?
Yeah, that's actually true. Not only as far as the CO2 removal, but we've actually found that eroding metal like that, when it oxidizes, gets up in the water column, it's actually good for larval fish. They feed on that. So there's actually a benefit to metal oxidizing and eroding, rusting basically. They're feeding on rust.
Thank you. Another materials related question. Tony Rose. Tony, hello. Glad that you can join us. Tony is an avid environmentalist, and we partner with his organization, Natural Resources Protection Association, for many beach cleanups. So glad he could join us. Tony asks, local environmentalists in New York City were afraid of asbestos material on the old subway cars. Was that a consideration?
Oh, it absolutely was a consideration. We worked with EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, looking into that to see what would happen. Essentially, asbestos is an airborne hazard. The problem is when you breathe it in, when fibers get into your lungs, that's the problem. Underwater, obviously, that's not a concern in that regard. People were concerned about, would it, for example, clog gills of larval fish or things like that if these fibers got up into the water column. EPA looked at that. They looked at the amount of asbestos that was in, and again, I will say the asbestos that was used, it's sort of almost like a cement material with the fibers in it that was sprayed on the walls of the subway cars. So it's not like they were airborne or going to float around or anything like that. But EPA looked at the actual amount in each of the subway cars to see if they did dissolve, if they did get released into the water column, would there be a problem? And they said that, and again, their exact words, if every single fiber were released into the water column at the same time, the concentration still would not be enough to cause harm to fish.
Great, good. That's reassuring. Ira Gershenhorn. Hi, Ira. Ira's a regular volunteer with H2O. How does the composition of reef cones different from regular concrete? And then he follows up, a company in Israel makes e-concrete. Allied Concrete has oyster castles, and I can get reef balls from Florida, and those reef balls have been used in on the West Harlem Piers here in New York City, and near the new Tappan Zee Bridge.
Right. Yeah. When you use concrete, you have to look at things like the pH of the material itself. And as I mentioned before, some concrete has like hardeners and additives to strengthen it, and you have to be careful about what those additives are. And then things like fly ash, something like that is that can be very toxic, so you can't use that sort of material. So basically, you just want a very pH neutral type of concrete without additives.
Great, makes sense. Ira asks, in terms of getting things done, is the permitting process, has that been a bear? Doesn't seem like it. I mean, it just seems like you keep on expanding. It would be
Well,
great. Yeah.
In some cases, it is getting worse. But for the most part, you have to go through the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and in some cases, your local Department of Health and Environmental Control or coastal management agencies. But artificial reefs have been around for so long now that the process is pretty streamlined, and these agencies know what they're doing and what they're looking at. So overall, it does take a little bit of time to get permits through, but it's really not too bad. And once you have a permit, you can keep renewing it, keep using it. It's only the newer permits that are delayed a little bit, but overall, it's really not a terrible problem.
Good to hear. Okay, just why don't we do 3 more questions? And then if people want to submit their questions by email, we'll do our best to get them answered. And again, I want to thank Bob for his candid answers and just for such a fascinating presentation. Okay. Next question. Tony asks another question. How do you deal with fishermen and MPSs? They like structures that add fish, but don't like being told that they can fish some places and not other places,
Right.
Even though the MPAs enhance life overall.
Right. Well, that's always going to be a problem. And I will say most fishermen are pretty good about it. They want to conserve the resources well. They want to be able to keep using it for years and years. So most fishermen are really good about it. Now, there's always some people that they just care about what they catch themselves, and that's all they're interested in. So enforcement is a concern. We have a department law enforcement agency with nice boats. They go out and they patrol some of these areas. Coast Guard does a little bit of patrolling, but it is a concern, something that needs looking at. But again, there's not much you can do about it other than patrol these areas to keep people out. So,
got it. Makes sense. Jill Benzer asks, is someone researching for sources of materials for the ongoing reef building? And are there more areas where this can be done?
Most reef programs are always on the lookout for material. Some programs just build a lot themselves. Some folks are always looking for vessels, bigger ships, and things like that. So it really, each individual state program sort of takes care of itself, where they, looking at where they can get material. It's just an ongoing thing. We're always on the lookout for suitable materials.
Beautiful. I think that's a good place to stop. I do see more questions coming in. So I encourage everyone to, if you do have questions, please email them to us, and we'll do our best to get them answered for you. And but again, thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you so much, Bob, for such an interesting talk. Somebody did ask, I'm going to cheat and say, will we present Bob again? I'm sure a lot of other people would want to see another presentation. And the answer is absolutely, we will. And how soon that is will depend on Bob's next trips down to the subway reefs, and if he wins his next tug of war with the next octopus that he encounters. So on that note, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. Thanks again, Bob, so much. It was a great presentation.
Thank you, Bob.
Again.
Awesome.
And so we've recorded this. We're gonna post it in a couple of days. And again, please submit your questions, and we'll do our best to get them answered. Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Bob. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Wonderful videos. That was